Weaving is a big subject. We humans have been doing it for tens of thousands of years and by lots of different methods with various levels of mechanization. This is a story about the tiny slice of that history that is this 4-harness Swedish-style floor loom that my mother bought used in 1970 and has now given to me. Thanks, Ma. I was in Vermont visiting my parents recently and barreled through the whole process from cone to cloth without consulting my mother, the expert, just to see if I could do it all by myself. And I documented it for your pleasure and education. So here we go. I needed a warp. The warp is the long parallel threads stretched from beam to beam on the loom that form the base into which you weave the weft. So I put together one of my mom's many warping devices, this lovely maple warping frame, and hit her up for whatever cotton yarn was going begging. I chose all the sort of green through white stuff, and ideally I'd wanted about 16 inches of width, which would shrink down smaller in the weaving and finishing and end up 13 or 14 inches. But I really just had to see how far these cones of yarns got me. The reed on the loom had 10 dents per inch, which I put 2 threads through each of them, making 20 threads per inch. So ideally I needed about 320 strands to my warp. I could wind 3 strands at the same time using this spool rack, so I tied off the ends at the bottom of the frame and wound my way upwards, looping round the figure of 8 at the top and back down. And up and down, always passing the same way round the figure of 8, which is there to allow me to keep all this spaghetti in some kind of order when I come to put the warp on the loom. In the event, some strands broke, and I added others, and the colors went where they pleased, and one bit got crossed over. It all went a bit wrong here and there in various ways, but in the end I got 300 and some odd strands before I ran out of yarn, so it's fine. It'll do. I tied off the figure of 8 crossover bit so I didn't lose it in transport between the warping frame and the loom, and then I chained the warp off the frame. I needed to remove the reed and push the heddles out of the way to feed the warp, crossover end first, to the back of the loom. The idea of the crossover is that you put these sticks through it and spread it out in the right order, and the crossover maintains the thread order and sort of combs the yarn as it goes through onto the beam. So the loop ends get pulled on a bit and attached to the beam apron with a stick, spread out approximately the intended finished width of the cloth. And then I could start winding the warp slowly onto the beam while my dad held the length of the warp at an even light tension, giving it an occasional thwack to help remove tangles, and I wound slowly, using old USGS maps as a way of not letting the threads collapse on their own gaps and mess up my tension. In theory, the crossover is supposed to be keeping everything in order and doing the detangling as we wind. The reality is that the tangling is inevitable, and this was particularly tangly thread. Some threads broke and were lost entirely, which is not the end of the world with a random warp like this. All this breaking would have been a bigger pain in the ass if I'd designed a warp with a strict pattern, which would be ruined by the missing threads. I'd have to laboriously replace them, which can be done, but it's a faff, and I'm not playing that game this time. Anyway, having wound the lengths onto the beam, I cut the ends to an even fringe, and then I needed to thread the heddles. Heddles are these little metal eyes in the harnesses which are going to lift and lower particular threads to form the shed as I weave. So every individual warp thread has to be taken in order from the cross, pulled through the heddle on one of the 4 harnesses. Some really simple looms have only 2 harnesses, so that half the warp is up and half down at any given time, and the resulting cloth is called plain weave, and it's the kind of cloth you learned about as a kid, just over, under, over, under. This is a 4-harness loom, so I have more options, and I'm going to weave a 2-2 twill. So I need the harnesses to raise 2 threads and lower the next 2, raise 2, lower 2, all the way across. And then in the next pass to do the same but 1 thread to the right. And then the same but 1 thread to the right again, and then again. So there are 4 states, and that's why I need 4 harnesses. So I had to thread each one of these threads in the right order through a heddle on one of the 4 harnesses. If I wanted a steady 2-2 twill, that'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way across. But I wanted a herringbone twill, where the diagonal stripes change direction every now and again. So I needed to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 for a bit, and then change direction and do 4, 3, 2, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1 for a bit, and then back again. But the long and the short of it is I had to pull every damn one of these threads through a tiny eye with a tiny hook in the right order. And then I had to replace the reed and pull all those threads through the gaps in the right order as well. So finally I could attach these tied off ends to the cloth beam's apron with some string and wind forward until the warp was stretched from the back beam to the breast beam via all the right heddles and through the reed in the beater. I say the right heddles, you don't actually find that out until you try the shed, which is the gap between the lifted and lowered threads on each combination of harnesses. So let's hook up the treadles. Heddles, treadles. The harnesses are attached to these things which are called lambs, and those get attached to the treadles. I need one treadle to pull down 2 harnesses, which will pull the other 2 up via the counterbalance rollers, forming the shed. And each treadle needs to pull down a different 2 harnesses to make my twill weave. Luckily, this is standard stuff for the average weaver, and this loom is already set up to do that, and all I have to do is peg these dangly strings from the lambs to the treadles, and then test to make sure that each treadle pulls down the harness without anything snagging. And we're ready to test the shed. Clean shed, clean shed, clean shed, not a clean shed. At least one rogue thread always gets crossed over in the threading of the heddles. Not to worry, break it, untangle it, retie it. That's another tutorial entirely. Anyway, I fixed it. Satisfied with the warp, I prepared the weft. I wound a bunch of green thread onto a bunch of bobbins and stuck them into some shuttles, and wove a few cursory inches just to see what sort of result I was going to get. And the result was that, with the randomly ordered warp colors, it was almost impossible to see the zigzag of the herringbone twill pattern, and therefore I couldn't tell if there were mistakes. And also I didn't care. It's cloth, I'll take it, I'm on a schedule here. So I settled into weave, and weave, and weave, and periodically advance the warp, and weave, and weave. And now and again a USGS map fell off the warp beam, and I weave, and I weave, and weave, and weave. And then noticed that the cloth beam was full, to the point of potentially interfering with the lambs. So I needed to cut this stretch off and empty the cloth beam. I tied up the ends to start again, but meanwhile, here was a pile of cloth. I just tied a few cursory knots in the fringes so it didn't immediately unravel, and then I washed it, dried it, ironed it, stitched either side of the cutting lines to stop the initial cuts from unraveling immediately, hemmed those raw edges, and voila! Here are some table napkins. They're really lovely, actually. I'm really happy with them. So there's your quick tour, which obviously skipped a lot of detail, but hopefully gave you an idea of the process of weaving on a 4-harness floor loom. A loom which is now set up in my studio in sunny Yorkshire, and how it got from Vermont to Yorkshire is another whole adventure that I won't bore you with, but anyway, it's here, and I fancy weaving some Yorkshire tweed on it next. I'm also cooking up a video on weaving more generally, with lots of info about methods that need less in the way of room-filling equipment, and I'll be making some insanely difficult to make animations to explain it all, so watch this space for that. See you then.